Conversations with Garmamie. Our guest this time is Randy Turner. Good morning, Randy.
Good morning, Garmamie. How are you?
I'm doing well. Give us a brief introduction about yourself, please.
Sure. My name is Randy Turner. I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. I grew up in the East Coast, grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, joined the military when I was right out of high school at age 19. Did 21 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, where my first posting was in Winnipeg with the 2nd Battalion PPCLI. And then from there, I tried out for a unit that's here in Ottawa, and I finished out my career with 16 years at the Canadian Forces Special Forces.
Very interesting. Now, you also fought in professional mixed martial arts, and you fought between 2009 to 2017, and you fought every year between 2009 and 2017. And I'm curious to know a little bit more about what got you into MMA competition.
Sure. Yeah. So when I started kind of late in life, where, as you know, my first professional fight wasn't until I was 30 years old. But when I started training probably pretty seriously about 2 years prior to my first fight. And why I got into it was as a complement to help me with my work. So when I was employed with the Special Forces, I was looking for something that would not only help with the conditioning side of things, but the mental side of things that would bridge the gap between some of the experiences that would happen overseas in a military context and how the sport of MMA, what I thought at the time, would help complement my job. So that's how I got into it. And when I started with with martial arts, I started with jiu-jitsu. Really liked it. And then probably about 4 months later, I added Muay Thai. And then probably about 4 months after that, I added a component of wrestling. And then I kind of allowed those three disciplines to develop with me as the MMA career progressed.
How would you describe yourself as a fighter? What was your approach, generally speaking?
I would say if people were to ask, or sorry, if I were to ask somebody that watched my style of fighting, they would say I was an MMA fighter. Not a jiu-jitsu practitioner, not a striker. I was an MMA fighter. The thing I really liked about MMA was the wrestling side. I liked the clinch part of the fight, but I honestly liked all parts of it. So if there was a fight I was preparing for and he was a known striker, well, that's okay. I was okay with that. And if it was a grappler, same thing. I would say of all areas, my Achilles heel or the weakest component of my game was jiu-jitsu. So it was probably the ground side of things. That being said, some of those shortfalls were also some of the motivators to train the training paradigm, as not only as I got older and more involved with training and coaching, but also just for self-development. And what I mean by that was I noticed areas when I was fighting professional that were my weaknesses, and then trying to, minimize those weaknesses was really had a lot to do with the way the training regime would roll out. So I learned a lot from that.
What was your favorite memory of fighting and competing? Is there one that sticks out?
Favorite memory? Yeah, probably. Well, there's a couple, but I would say the one that sticks out the most was I fought for the Rec MMA Bantamweight Championship belt, and it was against a real tough dude from Winnipeg, and his name was Eric Perez. And it was an exciting time because things were starting to go really, really well with MMA, and I felt that fight, not only was it an exemplification of how my development overall was really growing, but how my understanding of the MMA sport was really starting to grow as well. So it was a good memory, not only because I won. It was a great fight. It went 5 rounds, went the full distance, and I've got the decision at the end. But it arguably could have went either way. Like, Eric's a super tough guy. We beat the snot out of each other for 5 rounds, and at the end of the day, having the hand raised was a memorable moment that I'll probably never forget.
Sounds good. We're going to move on to the theme of combatives and self-defense training. I'd like to know what's combatives and what's self-defense training. Are they the same? How does one differentiate between either?
Yeah, that's a great question. I get that asked for a bit, and I say what makes it different is mindset. Self-defense is more a defensive posture, and it's a more of a defensive outlook on a situation that somebody may find themselves in, and how can they safely defend themselves to get out of that situation. Where I find a combative mindset is a little bit more aggressive in terms of, self-defense will say without the use of potential tools or force multipliers. And a force multiplier, for an example, could be a blade, some sort of edge device, could be a belt, flexible tool, could be a blunt object. It really could be an extension of the hand, whatever might be readily accessible in the environment that you happen to find yourself in. So combatively, being able to use a tool to help create a force multiplier to defend yourself or your loved ones to get out of a very ugly situation. I think the mindset is what differentiates between self-defense, where people may not necessarily want to put their hands onto somebody else, but they realize that there's a requirement for their own personal safety, where a combative mindset is a little bit more aggressive, and they're going to not only use whatever they can at their exposure, they're going to get out of that situation, but it's going to be an ugly fight. I think so. The mindset is really what makes the differentiation between self-defense and combative self-defense.
Now, we used to hear a lot about self-defense training back in the day, in the 80s and the 90s, within the context of martial arts. But it seems that MMA has been in terms of contemporary styles, has been what's out there the most in terms of what people are practicing, in my opinion. So the question here is MMA training, in your opinion, is that good enough when it comes to, being able to defend yourself or being in a combative mindset?
I don't know if good enough would be the term that I would use, but I think somebody who has a solid foundation in martial arts is definitely going to have, I would say, an advantage facing somebody on the street who has ugly or evil intentions. I would say it's definitely going to help. But I do believe that there's a component missing where in a traditional martial arts setting, or even in a sport MMA setting, there's an agreement upon each athlete where they're trying to do harm to each other, but not in a lethal way. Yeah, they're trying to hurt each other. Yes, they're trying to, at the end of the day, find whatever angle they can gain an advantageous perspective on the situation and the outcome. But there's an agreement upon each other where it's in a controlled setting. There's a referee. There's a set of rules that they both have agreed to fight within, where on the street, it's not like that. And for anybody that's been in an altercation on the street, they can attest to it. And I can speak from experience. When you are faced with a situation, especially if there's more than one, when you're faced with a situation that gets violent, you're not sure what the outcome might be. Things happen very, very quickly, very fast. And there's an element of survival that kicks in. And it's built into our DNA to recognize that, not only recognize it when it's happening, but to be able to use that to get yourself out of a terrible situation. So I do think, somebody that's got a little bit of MMA, for example, and that could be anything. MMA is exactly that. It could be a mixture of a plethora of different disciplines. That would help on the street. But again, I'll come back to the mindset, because I do believe what I'm trying to show and share with the business of direct action is how important the mindset is. And somebody with an MMA background who gets confronted on the street, yes, they're going to be okay in terms of they've got a foundation that they can draw upon in an element of stress and duress. But what they may be missing is that killer instinct, that ability to take it to the next level. So oftentimes what I share with, when I'm teaching military or law enforcement guys, especially law enforcement guys, is I firmly believe that when it comes to eliciting a level of aggression to take care of a situation, rather than the notion of a switch, being able to flip a switch, instead, I like to use the term, it's a dial. So if we are confronted with a very dangerous situation on the street, being able to crank that dial up to a high volume to be above what we're being faced with is a good idea. Because if we simply just try to meet at the same level of aggression, we're already at a deficit. And the reason that I say that so confidently is because whoever is on the street with evil intentions, they have the initiative because they brought that attack or they brought that situation to you, right? So on a street perspective, we're already trying to play catch up. So what I feel is if we have the ability to crank it up, and then when the situation starts to resolve itself, then we need to be able to turn the volume back down. That way we're not going to, because we're living in Canada, and there's a level of accountability that goes along with some of the techniques or skills that may be applied on the street. You're talking about doing some serious damage to another Canadian citizen. You've got to be held accountable for your actions. So, if you're faced with something on the street, somebody's trying to rob you or somebody's got you at gunpoint because they want that, the cash that's in your wallet or whatever the situation may be, being able to crank it up. And then when things start to get into a level of control, being able to dial it back down. So I do believe controlled aggression is trainable. But there's a fine line between somebody with skill and then somebody with will, right? So we cannot have one without the other. So if you're in the street, for example, you can have all kinds of skill, but if you don't have the will to take it to the roof, then you're not going to do that under stress and under duress. And conversely, if you're a person that is willing, but you maybe don't have this skill to back it up, well, then there's a component there that as an individual looking for self-development, there's a component that we could probably bridge the gap.
Really, really interesting. And I want to get back to that in a minute. But first, can you tell us a bit more about your company, what the sort of services you offer? Because it seems like you offer a wide array of services.
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm trying to, what I'm trying to do with the Direct Action brand is I'm trying to provide an outlet for citizens of Canada who are interested. Maybe they have a notion or a belief of what self-defense looks like. And I want to be able to help them with that. So I truly believe, and I'll always be a practitioner of jiu-jitsu, for example. I love being a student and the learning just never stops. So I'm trying to do the same kind of thing with combative self-defense because there are so many areas to amplify or to improve upon in terms of a combative self-defense. What I've done is I've kind of narrowed it down a little bit. So the business, what we do is there's a component of conditioning that is foremost most important. And the reason I say that is you can have all kinds of skill if you choose to train that skill, but if there's an element of your physical conditioning that is missing under stress, under duress, you're not going to have the gas tank. You're not going to have the physical means to carry out what it is that you need to carry out. So first and foremost is conditioning. So we provide physical conditioning, and that's development with a combative mindset. So when we do physical conditioning, when people come in here, for example, the philosophy behind the Direct Action brand is to prepare the body and the mind for what potentially could happen in the street. So when clients come into me, if they're expecting buys and tries on Tuesday and back and chest on Wednesday, I'm not that. That is not it. So there's other trainers out there who will provide that for you, but that's not it. So when people come in for conditioning, we're going to tap into anaerobic threshold power. So building that capacity to do whatever it is you need to do with your body, having the gas tank and the lung capacity to do that. There's a push component, there's a pull component, and there's a movement component in every workout, right? So it's always different. In spatial awareness is factored in. So when we're looking up towards the ceiling or looking down towards the floor while maintaining balance, a little bit of agility, all of that is built in. And then with that blends into the self-defense component. So we do areas of striking with and without open palm strike options, clinch work. So how to defend a takedown, how to take somebody down, grappling, all forms of grappling. But then what makes this whole thing interesting is while that's happening, we'll add components. And the two, sometimes three components that I'll add is blunt objects. So defending against a stick, a bat, a crowbar, blade or edge objects. So very common for people to carry knives on the streets today. So we'll defend against, figure out not only how to use it, but also how to defend against it. And while I show, and this is where I'm very cautious when it comes to the edge weapon stuff, I do think it's very, very important that we teach people how to use the blade as well as defend, but using it is a component to understand where the vulnerabilities are if somebody on the street were to try to use a blade on you, for an example. So we always show both the attacks and defenses. So it helps bridge that gap of understanding should somebody be faced with a situation like that on the street. And then the last thing I teach, or the last part component to that, is firearms. So, teaching how to defend against somebody that's holding a pistol to your body, for an example, for whatever their motivations might be. And then the last component of the business outline is I teach firearms training. So I teach safe firearms handling with regard to live fire pistol, carbine rifle, and shotgun. So that's the business in a nutshell. Here at the location that I'm sitting in right now, located in Westboro, we do all of the hands-on stuff minus the firearms. Obviously, the firearms, there's two different ranges in Ontario, or sorry, in the Ottawa region that we'll use for clients that are interested in doing live fire firearms training.
Now, I think you also offer training for women's self-defense, right?
Correct. So
can you tell us about that?
Sure.
And the reason why you offer that?
Absolutely. So with the women's only self-defense, what I've noticed in the short amount of time that I've been doing this is women do want to train, but they're a little bit hesitant to train with other men in some cases, whether it's a level of comfort and insecurity, whatever it might be. So what I've noticed is bringing women together, normally if they bring a friend, they feel more comfortable. So if they bring a friend or two, they feel more comfortable. So providing a small group setting for female only, I find it provides an environment for them to learn comfortably, not feel threatened in any way, not feel insecure in any way. And then one thing that I'll try to do with the women's only specific training is I do believe that it's important that women do train with men, because the realities are if they're faced with a serious situation in the street, chances are it's going to be a man. So if they're always training with women only, there's an element there that we're missing from the psychological perspective. So once the rapport is built with some of these women who I have exposure to, I'll strongly encourage that when they are given the opportunity, that they do train with a man, somebody that's probably a little bit bigger, probably a little bit stronger, so they can get comfortable with being uncomfortable, essentially. But that takes a little bit of time. So normally at the beginning, I'll definitely introduce females to how to defend against grabs, how to defend against somebody that's clutching onto them or that is inside their personal space that they don't want there. And then over time, once a rapport is built, I'll strongly encourage that they do get comfortable training with men in a very similar setting. So it's controlled, it's safe, but the element that's different is the fact that there's a bigger, stronger, heavier man that's on top of them or clinching onto them, so they have to deal with that.
Do you also offer courses for youths, maybe who might need some confidence or anything like that in terms of mindset?
I haven't really advertised or promoted a youth concept yet. But it's funny that you mentioned that, like, not funny, haha, but in a general state, what I find is some clients that come in here after they've built a bit of rapport, they open up a little bit. And there's been some clients who have blatantly said to me, they look me right in the eye and said, thank you for what you're doing. I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't found this, and you can tell,
wow.
It's heavy. You can tell, like, it not only builds their confidence, but it gives them a different perspective on how to become the best version of themselves. And I tell you, that is motivating when a stranger, after you build some rapport, maybe 4 or 5 sessions together, opens up, you can tell that it's having an effect on their psyche. It's having an effect on their ability to be confident, walk the streets with a little bit more upright posture. And it's amazing.
It's we're going to move on to the topic of coaching, and you kind of just answered this one already, but what aspect of coaching do you enjoy the most? Because it seems like you have all sorts of different clients, right, with different needs and so on, but generally speaking, what aspect of coaching do you enjoy the most?
I would say the thing I enjoy the most about coaching is trying to build rapport and tap into everyone's archetype. So each individual that walks this earth, as we know, they are a different archetype. They have components of learning and components of motivation that keeps them coming every day and coming, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. And what I really like about coaching is the personal aspect of connecting with that individual, trying to figure out what their motivation is, what makes them tick. And then once I find that, it really lights things up in terms of, for an example, if somebody is a visual learner, I'll use terms and phrases such as, how did you see that going? Or where can you see yourself in 6 months? Because I know that there's a visual connection to the words that are coming out of my mouth. And then the other thing that I like to do as well is get some feedback from the client, and the words that they choose to describe a situation or a scenario. A lot of times I'll use the same words and the same phrases so it connects with them and they can resonate with what it is, the message that it is that I'm trying to pass on to them. So from a coaching perspective, I think the thing that I really, really enjoy is the personal side of everyone's background. And I do think that all of us, we're all dealing with something. When I say dealing with something, everybody has their own internal battle, whatever that might be. Or there's, external extenuating circumstances that they're trying to overcome. And, after a rapport is built with some of these clients, it is really, really enjoyable. It's rewarding. And I love the fact that when we do make that connection, how not only the relationship grows, but their confidence grows and their ability to want to come back grows. And it's really motivating.
How much research do you do? Because you seem very invested in this, and obviously you have a lot of professional and personal training involved. But how much additional continuous learning do you do?
A fair bit. When I do have some downtime, which recently hasn't been a lot, but I do like to study and continue with the education. And the thing that I'm really interested in is there's kind of 3 areas. So psychology as a whole, but sports psychology specifically, I study on a pretty regular basis. Nutrition, diet, nutrition, I study on a pretty regular basis. And then the third thing that I like to put my interest in some continued study and reading is organizational behavior.
Wow.
So those 3 topics, as you can imagine, there's so much to learn, and I find some good material that's available. I've done some formal training as well with some different online educational institutions. But to be honest, most of the time when I start to search, I'll find a document or a suggested reading by a professor from whatever university. And once I can see that it's been validated by something of that level, then I normally will invest into, reading that article. But normally I'll skip through when I see find an article or have somebody recommend an article, I'll kind of skim through it to find out where it came from first, do a little bit of fact checking. And if it's from a reputable university or released by Professor so-and-so from university of whatever, oftentimes I'll read it. But that being said, it doesn't have to be from a university as well. There's a lot of people out there that have a lot of great knowledge and a lot of experiences to share. And what I do find is very beneficial is, listening when somebody is open to share an experience, is really listen and try to understand what it is that happened, what was the outcomes, and how could it have been different, and that's what I do internally. When I listen to somebody's story or when I'm reading an article, I try to think about, all right, well, this is what happened. These were the facts that elicited a situation, and the end result was this. Well, how could it have been differently? Or how could it have gone a different way?
I just have 2 follow-ups on that. In terms of what is it about organizational behavior that drew you in? Because it's a fascinating subject. And in terms of listening to different perspectives, how do you filter? How do you keep yourself? Because I would imagine you would need to have an open mind and you have to be objective. How do you remain objective in your assessment? Because we all have biases and so on, right? And they influence the way we see things, feel things, and see things. So
yeah, that's great. Great question. I truly believe that I'm pretty self-aware. So I keep myself very honest, and I know I have lots of great experiences that I'm drawn upon to help others essentially, but I don't have all the answers. And sometimes people will ask me something and it'll challenge whether or not I've got a reasonable answer or solution for them. And if I don't, then I go to work. That's when, I'll take notes and like, okay, I need to find out more about this. And then I'll do my own research and try to back it up. With the organizational behavior, when you're talking about how hard it is to change one thing about ourselves, for example, we look in the mirror and say, I want to do this differently. How hard it is to change one thing. Some studies have indicated from an institutional perspective, if we want to see one positive change, it could take up to a decade. So, like say we're 2020, we want to see a positive change from an institutional perspective. Well, we could probably expect we're not going to see that positive change really, take heed until 2030. So that's what kind of motivated me to want to learn more. Is like, why is that? Why does that happen? And how come it's so hard to change when you have, to your point, cognitive biases is a thing. Confirmation bias is a thing. When people see and hear a certain thing that they just a little nugget of what they might believe in, they grab onto it, right? Because it's going to support their thought processing. So that's what I find really interesting about not just connecting with people one-on-one, but also from a bigger, a grander scheme with regard to Canadians as a whole, or an organization that one may be involved with.
If we could just jump back to coaching, because you deal with so many different, I would imagine, clients at different levels of motivation. I would imagine some people who walk in are extremely organized, motivated, and disciplined, and some people, might appear like they have their stuff together, but are lacking some core fundamentals of motivation. How do you, and I think you've kind of answered it, but I want to go back to, how do you customize your approach from going from elite level, person in terms of athlete, athleticism, and drive in life to someone who might be dealing with, let's say, depression, who might be dealing with who knows what, right? All sorts of people have their own issues, but how do you switch that? Because and how hard is it for you to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's part of the motivation why I really love doing what I'm doing, because you're absolutely right. Everyone that walks in that door has something different, and some clients have been open with me. They're like, I have an eating disorder. Some people have been open with me and they're like, I go see a therapist every Tuesday night for an hour. I'm like, okay. If they're comfortable enough to open up with me, then that shows there's a level of trust that is built, right? And once you have trust, that you've got a solid foundation for growth. If there's no trust, then it's going to be a rocky road at the very beginning. So what I try really, really hard to do with every client that comes in is really listen. When they start to talk, I listen. I don't try to wait until they're halfway through finishing their sentence so I can respond. I want to listen deeply, and really connect and find out what it is that's motivating them to come through that door. And then sometimes that takes one session. Sometimes that takes the first 5 minutes, I can tell. Sometimes, people hold their cards close to their chest, so it takes a little bit of rapport. It takes 3, maybe 4 sessions. But once that open door happens and once that level of trust is starting to solidify, then there's great things that happen between myself and the client. And the motivating factor is, you're absolutely right. Sometimes people just need a pat on the back and they need to just hear, you're doing a good job. Other people need a kick in the ass and they need to be reined in because they think there's something that they're not. And I am comfortable enough in my own skin to look somebody in the eye and be like, hey man, you think you're fit, but I'm telling you, your conditioning is poor, and they're like, what? Well, why? And I say, look, you can lift, 200 pounds, great, but you can't run 100 meters. You run 100 meters and you're out of breath. Your conditioning is poor. We need to round that out. Yes, you can lift strong, you're big, that's good. That has a component. But if you're unable to, run to the end of the driveway without being out of breath, then we have some issues that we need to rectify. And some people don't like to hear that. But I'm honest with them, and here's the thing, running a business, if somebody feels insulted in some way, they may not come back. But I'm not willing to jeopardize the brand, the Direct Action brand, for $1. So, so I'll look at somebody in the eye. They may not like to hear it, but chances are, if they are insulted by what I say, then there's probably a level of truth that cuts deep, and they'll probably leave pissed off. But 9 times out of 10, they'll come back. They'll come back because they'll realize, yep, you know what? That's exactly what I needed to hear. I didn't like to hear it, but I needed to hear that.
That's fascinating, man, because I think within the context of I'll give you an example, combat sports, I think that honesty in the coaching is so important, and telling your athlete, hey, your technique is poor, and being direct about it, and even in terms of their own safety, like especially with some combat sports, because we tend to see a lot of athletes take such a beating sometimes, and people want to compete and they want to keep fighting, but sometimes you wonder who's responsible for telling this person to say, hey, like, just transition out of this fight game. You've fought well, but you're incurring a lot of damage. Like, that component of honesty that you speak of, I think is really important for a lot of fighters nowadays, because we tend to see a lot of athletes at a young age in their 20s getting severe concussions, and it's damaging to their lives, that down the road. But I want to go back to that topic of honesty, in terms of when you tell these people, hey, you're strong, but you don't have any endurance. How do you know when to dial that in, if I could use that example? How do you know? Because sometimes you built a rapport with someone,
Yeah.
they trust you, but they may have trust issues, right? And like, say, I guess it goes both ways in terms of the trust theme, but in situations where, let's say, you begin to see a lack of confidence in this person's ability to mitigate between going 100% and going 50, and they might be a risk to themselves, and their community. How do you know when not to coach someone? And I'm sorry, you don't have to answer that. I know it's a little complicated, because a lot of people may want to learn how to do an arm bar, but maybe sometimes some people aren't, like, maybe you don't want to coach that person because they might not have it all. They may not all be there, if you know what I'm saying.
I do. And I do sometimes feel like I force a little bit, like I'm trying to force something on somebody. I'm trying to help them so much. I'm giving them everything, emptying the bucket of knowledge, and it's just not connecting. And what I've noticed, and I've made some mistakes along the way where I'm trying to force something that is not there. And when that happens, I really try to revert to what I refer to as the 70-30 principle. So when I see a client that is trying, and they maybe have trust issues or confidence issues, but they're trying, they're here, right? That speaks volumes. They chose to be here instead of anywhere else. So they've already overcome that first battle. So the 70-30 principle is, we only have a finite amount of time to train or to develop in certain areas, right? So 70% of the time, what I try to promote is, let's work on the things that we're not really good at yet. Let's work on the things that need a little bit more refinement. And then to keep confidence levels up, normally the last, 15, 20 minutes of a session, then we revert to the 30%. And the 30% is focusing on the things that you already are good at, the things that you really like to do, because those are the things that are going to motivate you. Well, actually, not only motivate, but it's going to, if you already have a solid foundation, it's going to make that foundation bulletproof. It's going to be, so much more dependable when and if you ever have to call upon it in a moment of stress or duress. So the 70-30 principle, I revert to that sometimes when I'm having a hard time, or I'm getting a little bit frustrated with connecting, can't figure it out. Then I'll revert to the 70-30 principle. Like, okay, we only have an hour. 70% of this, we're going to work on the things that you're not really good at yet, but you enjoy doing. And then the last 30 is going to be focused on the things that I already know you're good at and I know you like to do. So we're going to finish the session on a high. So that's kind of the way I try to attack it.
I have 2 more questions for you. In terms of the mindset, it seems like you have a very holistic approach to how you teach, and it's really fascinating, and it's interesting, and it's an opportunity, I think, for many people, from elite level athletes to whatever, you know,
Yeah.
everybody essentially. But the question I wanted to ask is, do you offer any sort of like lectures or discussions or workshops on these sorts of things, primarily on not the physical but the mental component of training?
I do actually. I do. I have a couple of clients right now that I do Zoom and virtual calls with, and normally once every 10 days. Some clients it's once every 2 weeks. We'll connect for 30 minutes or an hour based on the client's request, and sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's video, and yeah, we'll talk about psychological resiliency. We'll talk about what mental robustness looks like, how to bounce back from a setback, some areas to overcome when we're faced with challenges and when things get tough, how to embrace that instead of trying to suppress it, but instead channel it to use in a positive light, take the right step forward. We talk about activation, emotional control. We talk about visualization. There's a lot of stuff that in some cases, the feedback that I've received, what they like is I kind of trim the fat for them. So we get right down to it. So in 30 minutes, I'll build a rapport with the individual first, so I know what kind of things that they're hoping for, what it is that they're dealing with. Once I have that information, then we can start to go to work. And it's enjoyable from both parts. Like some of these clients, they look forward to that call every 10 days or every 2 weeks, and myself as well, because I know that there's a serious component that a lot of Canadians are dealing with in terms of the mental side of health. And in some cases, I think there's a lot of tools out there for people to utilize, but sometimes they just don't know what tool fits the job. So some cases, these clients are already doing certain things, but they just don't have the scientific or the theoretical connection with what it is that they're doing.
Very interesting, and it's not holistic for them. It's not complete of an approach, and it sounds like you're offering that. I have one last question for you. I'll just give you some context. Obviously, I've seen you fight. I know you from your fighting, but I don't know you personally. But I've over the years, and even on Facebook, because we're Facebook friends, I always tend to see a lot of people whenever they comment about you. It's always positive things, but also it seems to me like you have a very good reputation, but moreover you're a very positive individual, because a lot of your messaging is always positive. It's always uplifting. You know what I'm saying? It's never negative. And I always wanted to ask you this back in the day when we were doing interviews and so on. Where does that positivity come from? Because it seems genuine, but how did you cultivate that?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking that question. It is genuine because we live in a world today where it's so easy to focus on the negative, and everywhere you look, it's negative, negative, negative. And I am who I am, and I'm comfortable in my skin, and I am very, very self-aware that there is absolutely no negative effect to being positive. So it's become who I am, and I'm very proud of one of those. That's a trait about myself that I'm very proud of. Now, keep in mind, I'll back that up with there are things that I'm working on internally. Like I'm aware of my faults, and I'm trying to get better at that. But absolutely, I think the world needs a little bit more positive, and the amount of energy that it elicits to say something kind of shitty or to be negative about a situation. Well, you know what? It requires probably the same amount of energy, or maybe even less, to be positive. And that's what people need. That's all people need. They just need to hear, yeah, man, it's okay. And I think it was cultivated over years of facing true hardships. I've lost buddies overseas, close friends. I've watched family members suffer for, one health ailment or another. there's experiences that we all live through that once we live through them, you can't unsee it or you can't unhear it. It happened. So with those experiences, we have a couple of choices. We can allow that to internalize in a negative light, or we can use that as power to project positive to others who may be dealing with something very similar. So that's what I'm trying to do. And, when it comes to the fighting, there's a lot of lessons learned when an individual loses, because it's not a good feeling. And I can tell you some of the stuff that I'm trying to help others with is because of the mistakes that I made. And then I'm trying to help them avoid those mistakes. And I'll give you an example that I haven't shared with too many people, but I feel like sharing it this morning. So I can be honest with you, like the last 3 fights that I fought were all losses. And I lost those fights before I even stepped into the cage. Wow. Because my paradigm and my motivation and my why for fighting was not in line with the reasons that I was fighting. So I lost those fights before I even stepped in the cage because I was fighting for all the wrong reasons.
Wow.
I loved to compete, and I still do. I'm a very competitive individual. I love competing. I loved fighting, loved it. But where I fell was before stepping into the cage, I so badly wanted to end my career on a high. I wanted to end my career with my glove raised, my hand raised in victory. And that is not a motivation for fighting. And I would, if there's any information or any advice that I could share young up and coming fighters, know this. Our fight careers are very, very short. And the amount of damage that our bodies will undergo during training and during competition, depending on how that competition unfolds, are everlasting. So if you're going to step into the cage, know that there are some serious consequences that go with that. It's no joke. And those things you're going to have to live with for a long, long time. So if you're going to if you're motivated to fight, and I encourage it, the sport is amazing. There's so many positives to mixed martial arts, combative fighting. But all I would say to an athlete that's thinking about it is your why has got to be strong. Your why to step in the cage has got to be powerful, because if it's not, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you may get seriously hurt, or you're going to find a way to lose. You're going to find an outlet to either tap early or, to get us into a situation where the referee is going to call that fight. So just be aware of that. And there's ways to train that to avoid that, but your why has got to be strong. And for me personally, what I learned from those last 3 fights was exactly that. My motivation to train was there, and I was looking forward to the fight, but I was fighting for the wrong reasons.
Wow, man. Thank you very much for this learning experience this morning here. It's been, this has been an incredible interview, and I appreciate your time and your honesty. And where can we find you online if we're interested in training or checking out some of your services?
Sure. Everything online is Direct Action Combat. So Instagram and Facebook, as well as the website. It's www.directactions with an S. So that's directactions.ca. And then if people want to reach out to me directly, they can reach me at randy@directactions.ca. So Instagram feed, there's a YouTube channel that's up and running, all direct action combat related. So yeah, those are the feeds. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I know you and I have crossed paths a couple of times, and I do appreciate chatting with you. You've got some great insight. I like what you're doing, and for what it's worth, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate it.